What's up, everybody? It's Josh. I want to talk to you about Charles Xavier and Magneto in the MCU and the strong possibility of these characters being race-bent. This comes on the heels of some crazy rumors and leaks with regards to Giancarlo Esposito and Denzel Washington being Charles Xavier and Magneto in the MCU. And personally, I think there's a strong possibility of this actually being announced at D23. And even if it isn't officially announced at D23, this is still a substantial rumor that we need to discuss because I'm sure many people feel differently about this. So in this video, I want to talk about why this would be a controversial pick for many folks out there, how I feel Marvel should tread lightly with the discussion around this race bending if it indeed happens, but I also want to discuss why I think this could absolutely work for these characters and why I think Marvel has very carefully considered this as one of their options. So I think it's worth starting here by talking about the fact that this is a rumor that's actually been out there for years. And in fact, I think as far back as 2 years ago, there were discussions about Denzel Washington playing Magneto and Giancarlo Esposito playing Professor X. And what's really interesting is we've had a couple of things recently pop up in the news that made this whole thing swell back up again. I mean, first, you have Giancarlo Esposito actually talking about his desire to play Professor X at a Comic-Con.
There is Professor X. I'm going to go for something that is a little bit different. I'm going to go and put it out in the universe that it is Professor X.
On top of that, with D23 being right around the corner, many different people are teasing out rumors for that convention, and this dude, Emmett Kennedy, who does seem to have some connections with Hollywood people, came out and said that Denzel Washington and Giancarlo Esposito will be coming to Phase 5, and they're likely to be announced at D23. And I just want to stop for a second here and say, maybe you're actually coming to this video after D23 and they were officially announced. That's still fine. Like, this video will still be very engaging and entertaining for you, because there's a lot to get into, and just because it's official doesn't really take any value away from the discussion we're about to have. So let's talk about the controversy, because I do think this would immediately trigger a lot of different people, and I think, you know, honestly, Marvel should be careful about how they would talk about these specific changes to the characters. And the number one thing, of course, is that we do live in this really divided culture war time where a lot of people just at face value do not like race-bending characters or sex-bending characters or gender-bending characters in your pop culture, right? There's this whole idea that, you know, things are going woke, and that a move like this to make Magneto and Charles Xavier black would be done just to be representative and to be woke. And a lot of that stuff's like low-hanging fruit. I think people just getting upset to be upset, but Marvel, I think, should be careful to not, in the face of such energy and criticisms, be really ridiculous with the way that they talk about it. Like, I would not come out and say, yes, Magneto and Professor X are black in the MCU, and the only people that are upset about this are racist. Because that kind of attitude and that kind of discussion just feels like really elitist. It feels really dismissive of actual criticisms, and even the people that maybe just do have a problem with it at face value because they would be black, those people would just be even more enraged and galvanized. And so I really hope that Marvel is careful with the way that they talk about it. Now, we'll get into in a little bit here how I would talk about this, because I think there's actually a lot of precedence within the comic books, the X-Men's Association with Civil Rights Leaders, to suggest that having these characters be black is a perfectly reasonable interpretation of those characters, and perhaps even a better one considering the modern age. But there are some things about the characters from the comic books that would make it kind of a tough sell for some OG comic book lovers on these characters being black. I mean, first of all, Charles himself is this kind of uppity white dude that comes from extreme privilege. One of the things that's interesting about the character of Charles is that he comes from a place of privilege and yet sees the plight of the mutants, becoming, you know, one himself, but he has a power that he can kind of hide. He could just live his plushy, so safe, you know, 1%er kind of a life, but instead he wants to help people, genuinely understanding the plight of mutants, understanding the plight of many humans out there, and he has this like a lot of empathy. So it is inherent to the character of Charles that he comes from this sort of elitist, wealthy background, but he is a people's person. Like, he's an everyday man. He loves all of these humans. He loves all of these mutants, and he wants to do the right thing. He wants humans and mutants to live in harmony. But I think you could obviously have that established with a black character. There's nothing to say that a black character couldn't come from extreme privilege. I mean, especially in the MCU, you have the nation state of Wakanda, one of the most isolated, Zionistic, and privileged nations on the planet. That is until, of course, T'Challa opens them up to the rest of the world. So you can have that dynamic exist, but I do kind of understand that if Marvel was going to try to go into a route where Xavier just comes from non-privilege and is just a black man that happened to have this mutation, and he faces racism, discrimination, and all of these different things, that is a pretty bad deviation from some of the principal things that make Charles Charles. Now, when it comes to Magneto, it's an even tougher sell, because one of the problems here is that Magneto in the comic books was a Jew that was entrenched in Nazi Germany. So he actually witnesses the horrible discrimination and murders and genocide of the Holocaust, and it pushes him to a really negative place. He hates humanity. He does not believe that mutants and humans can coexist together. And he has a much more militant and aggressive viewpoint on the mutant and human conflict because of his history in dealing with Nazi Germany. Now, there's all kinds of ways they could make this work. I mean, there are black Jews. This could be something that happens with Magneto. He could also be a generation removed from maybe his ancestors that really were Jewish. And I do think that there's something to be said for the obvious plight of being an African American, of being a black man in many parts around the world, and how similar that is to the discrimination that the Jews face. But therein kind of lies one of the problems. I mean, this is a historically hot button issue between the black community, especially black Americans, and the Jewish community, right? They've both suffered incredible atrocities at the hands of other human beings, and sometimes you get in a situation where these kinds of sufferings are even compared or stacked up against each other, and there's some kind of animosity that's built into conversations about the struggle of these two different groups of people, right? And so I do think this is a sensitive issue, and Marvel needs to be very careful on how they handle it. But now I kind of want to move into why I think this could actually work for the MCU. Now, one of the reasons that this could actually totally work for this version of the MCU, Charles Xavier and Magneto, is because the Nazi Germany thing was a long, long time ago. Like, in order for a character to actually have lived through that, they'd have to be like in their 70s, 80s, maybe even 90s, right? Depending on what age they were when it happened. So if you don't want to have a character that's ancient history, very, very old version of these characters, you actually must do something different. And again, you could do maybe a generation connection to that thing. But a lot of people like to bring up the fact that Charles Xavier and Magneto were modeled after civil rights leaders Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. Now, actually, as far as the research I have done, these characters, Magneto and Charles, were not created to mirror these two civil rights people, but along the way, the writers of X-Men did kind of understand that there's a big connection there and a parallel to these different leaders, and they did adopt some of the rhetoric and the actions from these different leaders into the dichotomy that exists between Charles and between Magneto. And that dichotomy is part of the brilliance of that relationship. It echoes throughout all of Marvel Comics, even in the most recent Jonathan Hickman stuff. It's a huge part of initially setting that up when they decide to actually work together. It's really, really crazy. So it's bedrock, fundamental to the conflict and the relationship between these two men. And you can actually create that with black actors and have the plight, or perhaps the sort of initial plight of these characters be based in their racial differences and the discrimination that they receive for being black men. Like, that's an obvious parallel. The civil rights movement was an obvious parallel to what happened in the X-Men comics. Again, it wasn't created to be that, but the writers pretty quickly realized that that could exist and kind of did lean into it. So it's perfectly reasonable to assume that Marvel, because of the time difference and because of the history that's in Marvel Comics, they could just really have these two black men be quite literal, I mean, figurative, but like really, good examples of Martin Luther King versus a Malcolm X and the sort of differences that they would experience because of that. I mean, again, the mutant problem, right, according to a lot of people in the MCU, is very similar to a way that a lot of white Americans and institutions viewed the civil rights movement and Black Americans receiving more rights and wanting to be considered equal, right? I also think at the end of the day, just taking all of that out of the equation, when I think of the characteristics of a Magneto and when I think of the characteristics of a Charles Xavier, I think Denzel Washington is an incredible actor that could really bring that kind of energy, right? So for me, these sort of race bending questions, they're kind of irrelevant, or at least they take a back seat to, can I see the performer bringing a lot of the stuff that I've come to recognize for that character from the comics to the screen? Can the performance in the actual MCU be incredible? And when it comes to Magneto, dude, Denzel Washington brings the heat, the aggression, the pure alpha masculinity, and just, he has all of the qualities that I would want out of a Magneto actor. And so you just take race out of the equation. I think freaking Denzel Washington is a perfect Magneto, right? And when it comes to Charles Xavier, Giancarlo Esposito is an incredible actor, and he's done a lot of villainous roles over the past couple of years, of course, after being Gus in Breaking Bad. But taking it back to what he said at that Comic-Con, he wants to do something different. He recognized that the hero's journey and this idea of uplifting is like really important, and I think he wants to take his career in kind of a different path. And I would absolutely love to see what an actor of Giancarlo's caliber would be able to bring to the role of Charles Xavier. I think he could do it, and I think it would be kick ass. So again, I think it could work. There's definitely some potential controversies that they're going to have to navigate through, but those are my thoughts. I want to know your thoughts about it. If you enjoyed this deep dive on this rumor, smash the like button on this video and subscribe to this channel for more content like it. And as I always say, I hope you're having an awesome and a nerdy day, and I'll see you in the next video.